Media-aware storage. So that's sort of kind of a lead-in, actually, there with what are we trying to accomplish here? Media-aware storage is taking the storage infrastructure layer and putting some intelligence on top of it so that it's not just storing assets, but it's actually aware of what those assets are and what needs to be done with them. So one of the things that we've been spending a lot of time talking about with our customers is the siloing of their storage environments. So they'll have, the streaming teams and the web teams have their sort of storage and production environments. So assets may be located there. You've got your archive environment, post-production environments, distribution, IPTV, VOD, et cetera. So the number of endpoints that our customers are delivering content to on a regular basis is growing. The number of things they need to do to the content to optimize it for those endpoints is proliferating, and they're struggling with sort of optimizing their storage environment to make sure that I don't have the same asset, megabyte or gigabyte assets sitting in 4 different storage environments when I don't need to do that, right? So how do I create sort of efficiencies on that? And the traditional model has been one where I have the sort of pyramid here, right? So I have the shared storage environments, usually kind of carved off by department. So I've got my editorial shared storage and maybe my production or playout systems storage environments. I've got my archive storage environments. And then I'll layer on top of that the workflow automation systems so that I can take content out of my storage environment and turn it into something useful. And that's usually driven and organized and indexed and searched, made discoverable by your media asset management layer that sits on top of that, right? So that's very much sort of the standard model for how our customers have been organizing their content to date. But one of the issues that this has is that I might be on a replacement cycle of once every 5, 7, 8 years for my media asset management system. My media asset management system isn't aware of the new types of content, doesn't have, say, the infrastructure schema, the metadata schema to sort of properly manage assets in that. I also have adopted a number of different storage systems for each one of my different departments, and things get pretty chaotic pretty quickly. And that's how I end up in that situation where I've got content that isn't useful, nobody knows what it is. Maybe my database to my asset management system went away or had some corruption, and now I've got these huge libraries of content sitting in storage, and I don't know what they are. I can't find them, I can't monetize them, they're not really terribly useful to me. Right? So one of the things that Cloudian and Telestream have been working on is there a way that we don't want to replace the asset management system, that's not the goal here, but what we do want to do is create this layer of intelligence in the object store directly associated with the assets that I'm storing in there. So I don't just have an asset, a blind asset that until I layer on this asset management system, I can do something useful with it. I have an asset that describes itself, it says what it is, it says what state it's in, and then that informs my workflow automation system. The two things work seamlessly together. So as new assets come into my system, the workflow automation can inspect that asset, it identifies what's compelling about that asset or what's useful metadata information that I can extract about that asset, what frame rate is it, what resolution is it, is it been color graded yet, has it been edited yet, is it a finished asset, is it a promotional material, et cetera. These are all sorts of bits of metadata that I can extract in a programmatic way based on where the asset came from, who published it to me, and then the heuristics of the asset itself. So these two things combined enable me to say, as the content comes into my system, I'm going to label it, I'm going to tag it with all this rich metadata, and then that metadata then is used to inform my workflow automation. This is all in concert with my media asset management system, but almost independent of it, right? So I don't need the media asset management layer to necessarily adopt these practices. It's all sort of inherent in the actual infrastructure that the asset management system is managing. So what does that look like? With Telestream products, we have Vantage as sort of our core processing system. That's our workflow automation tool. That's the thing that looks at the media libraries and the assets themselves, identifies what's interesting about those assets, and then does something useful with them. That could be transcoding, it could be QC, it could be compositing new, I would put branding elements in, or commercial spots, or promos. This is the thing that sort of enables that workflow automation. And then Cloudian, obviously, is the infrastructure itself, right? This is where the assets live. And by combining these two things into one really tightly integrated solution, I have this repository that's not just extensible across my on-prem and cloud environments, because Cloudian is going to enable me to scale seamlessly from my on-prem to my cloud environments, but it's also metadata extensible. So I can describe in a very, very rich way what's important about this asset, so that I can start building in all this automation around it. If I know what the asset is, I know what state it's in, I know how long I've had it, and I know what needs to happen to it, I can programmatically send that asset into the next stage of its life, right? This asset's a finished asset, it's been color graded, now it needs to go into branding and promo, it needs to go into my IPTV VOD delivery, it needs to go into my streaming systems. And so I can collapse all these different storage silos that I've had my content living in, and I can do this in concert with, but potentially on its own without having the asset management system having to adopt all these sort of best practices, right? So some of the things that we're doing here, we've got automated ingest, right? So as the content comes in, whether it's from a live source, off my cameras, coming in from a file system, coming in from an FTP source, Aspera, et cetera, the content comes in. As soon as it comes in, I'm starting that metadata enrichment process on the content. Within the Cloudian environment, I'm defining rules that express where and how I store this content. So as the content comes in, and maybe I write it into a cache layer in the Cloudian environment, this content's not going to be used immediately, so I'm going to offload this to lower cost storage environments. This content needs to go straight to edit. I'm going to offload this directly into the editorial shared storage environment. And now I'm actively managing that library. Again, the infrastructure itself is now what's actively managing the library stored within the infrastructure. So I can actually start making decisions about that content and running it through workflow. And then another important element here is QC. Every time some system is touching this content, I want to probably run that through another QC process to validate that I haven't broken the content in some fundamental way. It still looks good, it's still compliant with my distribution needs, it has audio, lip sync, when I send it to Netflix, it's not going to get kicked back because I'm breaking some cardinal rule about distribution into Netflix. So this is sort of just a high-level diagram of what that looks like. The benefits extend to, so you have the infrastructure layer, but now that's kind of the line as to what constitutes infrastructure is certainly blurring with on-prem systems and cloud systems, and the need for those two things to sort of work seamlessly together. It doesn't serve me terribly well if I have content that lives in both places and I'm not sure exactly where it is, and I have systems that are pulling it unnecessarily out of the cloud. I'm paying egress charges on that when I shouldn't need to because I have the content locally, or vice versa. The content lives locally, but my workflow needs to execute in the cloud. I don't want to upload that content if it's already exists there. So if I can create and sort of break down those barriers between my cloud object store and my on-the-ground storage environments, I'm better off for that. And the workflow system needs to be able to be smart enough to follow that content. So if the asset itself is currently stored in the US West region of Google Cloud Platform, I don't want to execute the workflow in my New York City office, and I don't want to execute the workflow in some other cloud environment. I want that workflow to execute where the content actually is. So again, that I'm not paying these egress charges as the content moves around, or I don't have to move that content to where my workflow is. I want to bring the workflow over to where the content is, right? So the object store is responsible for sort of blurring the line between what lives in the cloud and what's on the ground, and managing that, proactively managing that through rules. And then the workflow system needs to be able to address that and sort of work within that context to execute workflow where the content lives. So when you look at it in total, you've got I've got a metadata managed Cloudian object store. So I've got this rich metadata that's now describing the content that's coming into the store. whether that content started off as a live source or a file, whether that content originated on a camera system in my on-prem environment and originates on my on-prem storage or is coming in through the cloud, right? I want a common set of workflows that I can apply to all new incoming content, and then as the content progresses or matures through my system, gets ready for delivery, I want these things to be applied sort of programmatically. So what are those things? We're defining the ingest pipeline, right? And then normalizing sort of the processes that happen to content when it originates in my system. So as new content's created or comes into the system, I want to sort of normalize so I have a standard process for everything that's coming in. Everything gets checked for compliance. Everything gets checked for, has a QC check on it. Everything gets transcoded into my house format so that it's useful for me. And things that don't work, things that are coming in that are broken, incomplete files that were sent to me from a partner, corrupted files that came in off a camera card. I want to be able to also validate that. I want to be able to quarantine that programmatically and not tie up my high priority storage environments with all these broken assets. Right? And again, the important thing here is that these are capabilities that you might have in your asset management environment today, and we work closely with most of the big asset management vendors in the marketplace. But that's what we very consistently hear is that is a hurdle, a massive hurdle for our customers. If their asset management system today doesn't do these things, going out and evaluating and then purchasing and then deploying a new asset management system is a big deal. So if I can build this intelligence into the infrastructure itself, I can bypass that step and enable these kinds of capabilities without having to work on a multi-year project to update my asset management environment. It doesn't mean that you don't do that, but it just means that my infrastructure now doesn't require you to do that because I have this MediaWare infrastructure. The other thing that I have now is this concept of actively managing the content that lives in the object store, right? So in the past, an asset sitting on storage didn't do anything. It just was there, and it was dependent on some other system to index that asset and make it useful for my production workflows, for my editorial teams, and for anybody that needed to use that content, right? But now I can look at new content that's coming into the system, and then I can start building these logic trees in the infrastructure itself. A new asset arrived. Does it have captions? Yes, no. Okay, captions are present, send it on to the next step in the process. Captions are not present, send it off to a speech-to-text system or send it off to captioning and get captions for it. Now this asset has captions. What do I do with it? The next step, right? So what's the frame rate on the content? If it's this, do that. If it's that, do that, right? Is this content HDR or SDR? Is it QC compliant or not, right? And all of these things are programmatically part of the infrastructure itself, making it very easy for me to know that when content is said to be in a certain state or in a certain availability, when my editor needs to go in and use a piece of footage for their storytelling, or when I need to deliver this content to this partner, the assets that are in my storage environment are all fully all compliant with whatever my house rules are for assets that live within my infrastructure. So a couple examples of that. So this would be an example of identifying, augmenting, and then enriching the object storage metadata. So one of the things we did with Cloudian is Cloudian has an extensible metadata architecture as part of the object store. So I have the standard sort of S3 API that I can call as an object store environment. I can call and post metadata into that. But there might be fields, new fields that I want to create and identify and use to both inform workflow and to enhance discoverability of the assets in my system, right? But that extensibility needs something to populate those fields, right? So I need to do something to actually make that enriched metadata work for me. And so in this case, I'm watching for new incoming content. I'm copying it into the right location where it needs to be worked on. I'm notifying the system as to what the status of that is. I'm analyzing it to identify what are the attributes of this content that are important for me to plug into my object store, and then I'm writing that directly into the Cloudian object store, right? So once that's completed, now I can search for that content, I can find it based on the heuristics that I've identified around it, or I can inform workflow. I can say this content's already been QC'd, this content already has been color graded, this content has the captions present, et cetera, because I have that content metadata in the system. And by the way, what's important there is that again, I could have that metadata stored in an asset management system, and then if I have a well-functioning asset management system sitting on top of this, I would do that, right? I would both augment the metadata as part of the ingest process. I would write that metadata into the asset management environment, and I would write that metadata into the object store. But if I don't have an asset management system that supports the full extensibility that I want to sort of enable for my asset management system, for my content library, or I want to migrate to a new asset management vendor. Vendor A served me well, but now I'm moving off to vendor B. There's this huge migration of data through a database migration, schema mapping exercise, and all these other things. By associating that metadata directly to the assets in the object store, I don't have regardless of the asset management system that's sitting on top of it, I can read that metadata. I don't have to go into a database. There is no database. There's no database storing that metadata, right? So all that metadata is normalized and associated to the objects in the object store. So that really assists me in being able to be, if I don't have an asset management system, I still have a smart, aware, usable library. If I do have an asset management system where I want to migrate them, I have a very easy way to extract all the information about the assets in my library into the new asset management environment. A couple other examples, QC check for captions, another QC check. And then this is important here. So we talked about sort of the programmatic ways that I can extract metadata, but I also want to sort of enable human-curated or machine-curated. So if I have an AI system added onto here, I can look at what's actually in the content. Is it soccer footage or a fashion show, right? I can have human-curated content. We provide, within the infrastructure environment, I now have a dashboard where I can go in and say, okay, here's asset A, asset B, asset C, and start putting in more descriptive metadata about the content in the system, and then all that becomes discoverable within the S3 environment. So at the end of the day, and I'll just wrap up with this, and I know I kind of went a little bit long, but So we've launched this, right? So we've been working with Cloudian for about 6 months to take the sort of full suite of capabilities within Telestream's Vantage product for workflow automation and the Cloudian extensible metadata architecture and storage environment to create this new workflows, right? So now I have rules-driven, proactive object store that's actively managed. I think that's a big takeaway. You have these storage silos you can start breaking down, right? You have one environment now. I don't need storage necessarily. I don't need workflow that's optimized for one specific department in my company or my organization, because that metadata is extensible. I can have the full suite of metadata. I don't need to throw that metadata away as the content migrates from use case to use case. And then being able to sort of seamlessly execute my workflows, whether that content's on the ground, in the cloud, or in any other state, right? I have the ability to have my workflow follow my media, right? So those are sort of the big deals about this, and yeah, it's pretty exciting.